Our CEO canceled a $400,000 bonus and handed us invitations to a child's costume party. And the room went quiet in a way I will never forget, because he did not know I was already building the one thing glitter cannot bury: proof. So tell me, have you ever watched your hard work turned into cupcakes and slogans? Have you ever been told that culture replaces pay? What would you have done in my place? Would you speak up? Would you walk out? Or would you gather every receipt the way I did? Leave me your take in the comments. Share this with someone who needs courage today. And now I tell my story. Please take the time to listen to my confidences. I will speak sweet and angry, honest and careful, about the day I chose evidence over applause and watched the truth do what confetti never can. My name is Claire Donovan. I am 37 years old, and I have worked as a senior compliance manager at MedCore Systems in Indiana for almost a decade. I was born and raised in Evansville, a small town where my father worked in logistics and my mother taught school, so I learned early that details mattered, and that cutting corners was never worth the cost. By the time I joined MedCore, a mid-sized medical packaging supplier, the company had already been swallowed by 2 acquisition cycles and buried under layers of bureaucracy. But I stayed because I believed in the work. Compliance is not glamorous, but it is the foundation that keeps patients safe and companies alive, and I carried that responsibility like armor. For 2 straight years, my team did not fail a single audit, not one late filing, not one certification overlooked, not one loophole left open for a regulator to exploit. There were nights when I drove home past midnight with my son asleep in the back seat because I had picked him up late from my sister's house after reviewing vendor files 3 times over. There were mornings when I arrived before the janitors had turned off the hallway lights just to recheck certification renewals, because experience had taught me that optimism is cheap, but proof is priceless. My team understood this rhythm and lived by it. Paul Green, 39, our senior accountant, was brilliant in his quiet way, catching errors buried in thousands of lines of numbers. Sophia Ramirez, 34, who led procurement, had a quick wit and sharp instincts, balancing strict rules with resourceful negotiation. And Lena Morris, 29, the youngest analyst on my team, worked with the earnest determination of someone who had not yet been broken by corporate absurdities. Together, we carried the weight of standards that others dismissed as paperwork, but that we knew could mean life or death. When the board approved a $400,000 performance bonus pool after our 8th straight quarter without a citation, it felt like a rare recognition of invisible labor. For one evening, we allowed ourselves to believe in the reward. Sophia tapped her inbox like she was calling down a genie and teased, "Real cake this time, not vending machine cookies." Paul gave one of his rare half smiles and murmured that maybe cake was too much, but his eyes said otherwise. I did not say it out loud, but I quietly planned a weekend trip to Chicago with my son, something I had been promising him for years but never found time to give. I let myself imagine his smile when we walked through the gates of Navy Pier, the rare moment of being the kind of mother who was not always running behind. Yet even as I smiled with them, I felt a cautious edge in my chest, a voice reminding me that money is never safe until it clears the account. I had seen too many promises twisted by executives who spoke about family while cutting paychecks behind closed doors. I told myself not to ruin the moment, but deep down I carried the suspicion that good news rarely arrived in pure form. Still, when I looked at my team that night, huddled in the break room with paper cups of burnt coffee raised like champagne, I felt pride stronger than doubt. We had earned every cent, and for once I wanted to believe the company would honor that. What I did not know then was that this celebration, small and fragile, would become the last unbroken moment before everything shifted. And even though none of us could see the storm gathering, Some part of me already sensed that our clean record had painted a target on our backs. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning with the subject line, Quarterly Celebration plus CEO Town Hall. I remember staring at it for a long moment, sipping coffee that tasted like scorched paper, and feeling a flicker of unease. Our old CEO had retired suddenly after a dispute with shareholders, and the replacement, Ethan Price, age 41, had only been in the building for 3 weeks. He was one of those executives parachuted in from corporate headquarters, carrying glossy slides and vague promises, but so far, he had not touched compliance. He shook hands, delivered hollow compliments about crushing it, and disappeared back into his glass-walled office like a motivational speaker trapped in a fish tank. I told myself the town hall would be routine, just another performance review with applause at the end. Still, my instincts, trained by years of watching executives play games with livelihoods, whispered that something about the timing felt wrong. When we walked into the conference hall, the atmosphere was off. Instead of the usual spreadsheets and audit metrics displayed on the big screen, pink and silver sparkles looped in endless animation. Tables were scattered with candy-colored snacks, and at the center stage stood Ethan wearing a full-body Spider-Man suit, mask and all. My team froze mid-step, Sophia's eyebrows shooting up, Paul's mouth tightening into a thin line. Then Ethan shouted through the muffled mask, "Quarter 4, or quarter core, you crushed it." His voice echoed awkwardly in the cavernous room. Someone coughed. When he ripped off the mask, his hair stuck up like static had jolted through him, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a stunt. This was the man we were now expected to follow. The words that came next shattered the thin layer of hope we had carried. Ethan grinned, spreading his arms wide, and said, "I know you all were expecting a bonus, and I am proud of your numbers. But at MedCore, we are shifting our culture. No more transactional cash incentives. We are building connection, family, and joy." Then he reached under the podium and pulled out a stack of glossy invitations. "So instead of a bonus, you are all invited to my daughter Lily's 9th birthday party this Saturday. Marvel theme. Costumes required." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Sophia's mouth opened, but no sound came. Paul stared at his shoes like they might provide an escape route. I kept my expression flat, but inside I felt something cold twist in my stomach. It was not rage, not yet, but a deep recognition that a line had been crossed. Ethan strutted across the stage, handing out invitations as if he were Santa Claus at a company picnic. There will be pizza, a bounce house, custom cupcakes, even a leadership workshop for the kids. What would Thor do? Love it. His enthusiasm was so exaggerated it bordered on cruel. I glanced toward the HR table, where the new manager, a woman named Elise with a glossy LinkedIn smile, was nodding so hard her cheek twitched. My team looked like statues, frozen between disbelief and humiliation. Finally, I asked the question everyone else was choking on. "So the team bonus has been canceled." Ethan beamed at me like a child caught with candy. "Not canceled. Reimagined. We are a family now, Claire, and families do not need cash to celebrate. They need connection. They need cake pops." His voice rose, waiting for applause that never came. In that silence, I realized the truth. The $400,000 approved by the board was gone, dissolved into balloons and frosting and a vanity project dressed up as culture. Ethan thought he was untouchable, that he could buy loyalty with glitter and slogans. I sat down slowly, my invitation heavy in my hands, and told myself the same thing I had told my team before the town hall. Optimism is cheap. Proof is priceless. And what I held in my inbox, that signed approval of the bonus budget, was proof. Ethan did not know it yet, but he had just placed the first brick in the wall of his downfall. The morning after the town hall, the office felt like a funeral for common sense. The invitations to Lily's birthday party sat untouched on desks, their glossy colors too bright and too grotesque under the fluorescent lights. No one dared throw them away, not after the way Ethan had beamed while passing them out, so they became like radioactive waste, sitting there in plain sight and burning holes in our patience. Around noon, a chipper blast from Ethan's assistant filled our inboxes. The subject line read, "Do not forget to RSVP for Lily's Marvel Bash. Prizes for best costume. Hint, the CEO is Team Iron Man." My coffee went cold in my hands as I stared at the email. There was not a single mention of bonuses, not one acknowledgement of the quarter we had closed. Just cupcakes and costumes, as if money and recognition could be replaced with frosting and a rented bounce house. Sophia leaned against my desk, invitation dangling between her fingers. Her voice trembled, equal parts disbelief and anger. "Claire, this is theft dressed in glitter. They took our money and turned it into balloons." Paul did not look up from his spreadsheet, but his silence spoke volumes. He had the kind of quiet fury that built in layers, and I could see it pressing against him, though he said nothing. Meanwhile, Lena wandered by holding a cupcake with bright blue icing, her face pale. "They are tracking who eats them," she whispered, before tossing it in the trash like it was poisoned. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was so complete. What had been promised as reward was now reduced to a childish carnival. It was not incompetence anymore. It was mockery. By mid-afternoon, HR sent another memo, this time a full page written in the language of a motivational poster that had been hit in the head. Phrases like emotional currency and joy matrix danced across the page, promising us a future built on shared experiences instead of cash. One line read, "We are moving away from transactional gratitude toward communal celebration modeling." I read it twice and felt sick. They were not only stealing our bonuses, they were rewriting the language so that resistance sounded selfish. I printed the memo, filed it carefully, and slipped it into my growing folder labeled Ethan Errors. Experience told me that executives like him always believed their slogans could erase reality, but paper records had a way of surviving longer than empty speeches. At 3:00, Ethan summoned us to the break room for what he called a culture pulse. He stood beside the burnt coffee machine, arms spread like a preacher in sneakers, asking how we were feeling about connection over compensation. Sophia crossed her arms and muttered something about celebrating numbers first. Paul refused to look up. I leaned against the wall, my voice even, and said, "Do you mean celebrating the quarter we just closed?" Ethan blinked as if the thought had never occurred to him. "Well, sure, but that is not why we work, right? Not for a paycheck. We work for purpose." His words fell flat, landing like stones in a dry well. Not one person clapped, not one smile reached their eyes. Ethan's grin faltered, just for a second, before he plastered it back on and clapped for himself. When I walked back to my desk, the pink cupcake waiting there looked less like a treat and more like a warning. The truth settled heavy in my chest. This was not simply tone-deaf leadership. This was structural sabotage. Ethan was dismantling recognition, replacing systems with his personality, and building a culture where truth had no value. I stared at the memo again, at the sugary crumbs scattered across desks, and I knew I would not let this stand. Quietly, without drama, I opened a new folder on my laptop. Its title was simple and final, Contingency for Collapse. And one by one, I began dragging files inside. The collapse did not take long to spread, and it arrived wearing a powder blue blazer and a grin too wide for the occasion. On Monday morning, I walked into the compliance suite and saw a stranger sitting in the chair where Margaret, our retiring legal counsel, had worked faithfully for more than a decade. He was casually eating yogurt stolen from the communal fridge, spoon dangling like he owned the place. "Hey there," he said, lifting the cup toward me as if we were sharing breakfast. "Is this banana cream or just some kind of vague yellow? Either way, solid fridge game here." I froze, my mind tripping over his words. "You are?" I asked carefully. He popped up from the chair, fist raised for a bump. "Brandon Holt, legal strategy consultant. Partner-ish, you could say. Ethan and I go way back. Frat bros, actually. He said you all needed a fresh take on compliance vibes. Compliance vibes." That was the moment I knew he had stepped into dangerous territory. Margaret had built a framework of precision, double checks, and legal shields strong enough to withstand federal scrutiny, and now she had been replaced by a man who spoke about vibes. Sophia shot me a look from across the room, her face tightening like she was fighting the urge to scream. Paul lowered his gaze to his spreadsheets, the tapping of his keyboard harder than usual. Lena lingered by the copier, wide-eyed, as if she was witnessing a storm brewing in real time. I forced myself to stay calm, but inside my stomach turned. This was not incompetence anymore. This was intentional erosion. When I asked if he was replacing Margaret, Brandon laughed as if the very question were ridiculous. "No one replaces anyone," he said, dropping back into her chair like it owed him rent. "We are iterating. Compliance should not be a prison. It should be a choose-your-own-adventure book. That is what Ethan wants. Agility, flow, empowerment." He said the words like they were gospel, but his ignorance was obvious. He did not know the difference between an SOP and an NDA. He called FDA standards outdated hurdles and retitled a critical manual from risk response protocols to opportunity navigation playbook. He even bragged that he once read a tweet saying strict compliance frameworks kill innovation, and he seemed proud of building a legal strategy on that nonsense. Later that day, Ethan stormed into our suite with his ever-present protein shake and a plastic shield shaped like Captain America's. "Folks, we are pivoting," he announced, firing a foam dart at the whiteboard like a child. "No more clunky gatekeeping. No more fear-based checklists. We are reimagining compliance as a living, breathing framework for empowerment." His eyes landed on me, searching for approval, and I forced myself to answer. "Some of these frameworks are legally mandated," I said evenly. "There's no breathing involved. You either follow them or you face fines." He winked at me like I just told a good joke. "Love that passion, Claire, but do not be so black and white. There is wiggle room." He fired another Nerf dart. The thud against the board sounded like a warning. When he finally left, Sophia whispered the thought that had been pounding in my own head. "He's going to kill us all with vibes." Paul said nothing, but I saw his hand trembling slightly on the mouse. Lena looked ready to cry. I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence in capital letters across the page. "He thinks he is immune." Because Ethan truly believed he could erase rules with enthusiasm, and Brandon believed ignorance was innovation. But I knew better. I knew that regulations are not suggestions, and numbers do not forgive lies. As I closed my notebook, I made myself a quiet promise. Every file they touched, every shortcut they took, every false approval they waved through. I would record it, timestamp it, and save it. If they wanted to turn compliance into a game, then I would become the referee. And the scoreboard would not lie. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday afternoon when I opened a procurement file and saw a vendor's sterile room certification had expired 6 months earlier. Under normal conditions, the system would have triggered an automatic hold, halting approvals until the paperwork was corrected. That safeguard was built into our framework precisely to protect us from errors that could endanger patient safety. Yet the file was stamped green, approved, and cleared for distribution. My heart stopped as I read the initials scrawled beside the override, BH, Brandon Holt. He had waved it through. I marched to his desk, holding the file like a smoking gun. These certifications are out of date. This vendor is not compliant. If this goes through production, we are liable. Brandon barely glanced up, stirring sugar into his coffee as if I had interrupted a daydream. Yeah, Ethan already cleared that. We're good. His grin made my skin crawl. We are not good, I said flatly. If this ends up in a QA audit, we will be facing fines, lawsuits, and potential recalls. He leaned back in Margaret's old chair, folding his arms with smug ease. Do we really have to do the audit part? Can't we just believe they are compliant? Ethan says we need to stop acting like prison wardens. For a long moment, I stared at him in silence, struggling to keep my voice level. That is not how any of this works, I said finally, each word as sharp as glass. But Brandon only smiled wider, shrugging as though regulations were nothing but dusty traditions. I walked back to my desk, pulse pounding in my ears, and sat down. I knew then that the infection had spread further than I had imagined. The safeguards were being dismantled, one by one, and the people tearing them down did not even understand the danger. They thought it was flexibility. I knew it was negligence. That night, I stayed long after the others had gone home. The janitorial staff vacuumed around me as I worked, their machines humming like a low warning siren. I copied every vendor certification file onto an encrypted USB drive, time-stamped each export, and labeled them in a system only I could read. Then I emailed myself backups disguised as tax reference materials, slipping them quietly into a private off-network storage folder. I did not tell Sophia, I did not tell Paul, and I certainly did not tell Lena. Not yet. They were exhausted already, weighed down by disbelief and the humiliation of cupcakes replacing their hard-earned bonuses. The last thing they needed was the burden of knowing how deep the rot had spread. As I drove home under the sickly glow of the streetlights, I gripped the wheel tighter than usual. My son's voice echoed in my head, asking when we would take that trip I had promised. I thought of the $400,000 gone to confetti and cake pops, and of a company that was now gambling with risk, like it was a child's game. A slow burn of resentment filled me, heavy and steady. Ethan believed rules were obstacles. Brandon believed ignorance was strength. They were building a house of cards, but I knew the storm was coming. And when it did, I would be ready with the proof. It was a Tuesday morning when Ethan finally showed his hand, and in that moment, the thin line between incompetence and corruption snapped. He called it a vision sync, a 30-minute huddle in the break room with himself, Brandon, and the compliance team. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and pink frosting from the cupcake cart still rolling through the halls like a bad joke. Ethan leaned against the table, sleeves pushed up, smiling like a camp counselor trying too hard. Listen, he began, nobody actually reads compliance reports. They skim, they scroll, they vibe check. What if we just, smoothed a few things? Fudge some numbers? Not lying. Just rounding up. Elevating the narrative. His words fell into the room like a bomb. Paul looked up from his notebook, his expression flat. "You are asking us to fabricate compliance data," he said quietly. Ethan wagged a finger like he was correcting a child. "Big word, Paul. Not fabricate. Fudge. Adjust. People do not want to see boring delays or missing signatures. They want flow. Momentum. A good story." I felt the air tighten around me, my jaw locking so hard my teeth ached. Lena's hand trembled on her coffee cup. Sophia muttered something under her breath and stared at the floor. I watched Ethan's grin falter for a heartbeat, then return like nothing was wrong. He truly did not understand the weight of what he had just said. Or worse, he understood and did not care. Paul closed his laptop. It was not dramatic. He did not slam it shut or make a speech. He simply folded it, stood up, and walked out of the room as though he were heading to refill his coffee. He never came back. 5 minutes later, an email pinged across every major executive inbox. The subject line was simple: Q4 compliance reporting. The body contained only one sentence: "We can no longer certify Q4 compliance data." It was addressed to Ethan, the board, internal audit, and legal. No explanation. No footnotes. Just truth in black and white. I read it 3 times, my pulse thundering in my ears. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever felt inside MedCor's walls. It was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of tectonic plates shifting beneath our feet. Lena looked at me with wide eyes, whispering, "Does this mean we're all fired?" I did not answer right away. Instead, I closed Ethan's untouched cupcake sitting on the table and slid it aside. "Probably," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. But not today. That night, long after the others had gone, I opened my private folder labeled Contingency for Collapse and dragged Paul's email inside. It glowed there on the screen like a flare shot into a dark sky. Proof, undeniable and permanent. Ethan thought he could bend the truth into a story and no one would notice. Paul had lit the signal, and I knew exactly what came next. It was not just about saving my job anymore. It was about protecting the very foundation Ethan believed he could laugh away. And if he wanted a battle of stories, then I would meet him with something stronger. Receipts. The morning after Paul's email, the office was silent in a way I had never experienced before. It was not the comfortable quiet of concentration or the awkward hush of a long meeting. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy in the air, the kind that presses against your skin and warns you something irreversible has already begun. No one mentioned the email, not in Slack, not in the hallways, not even in the elevator where gossip usually thrived. But it hovered in every glance, every strained smile, every door that closed just a little too quickly. By noon, the deletions began. Standing meetings I had attended every Monday for 3 years vanished from my calendar without explanation. Lena's compliance review was suddenly postponed with no new date. Sophia's supplier audit calls were reassigned to someone in HR who had no idea what sterility testing even meant. Legal, which had once sent updates daily, went dark. Out-of-office replies sprouted across inboxes like weeds. One senior counsel's auto response simply read, "Please contact the chairman's office." That alone told me what I needed to know. The walls were closing in, and the board was moving quietly behind the scenes. Whispers spread faster than facts. A packaging associate mentioned that a private jet had landed at the regional airport. Someone in procurement whispered that the chairman himself was on board. I could see the tension creeping into people's faces, their voices dropping when they spoke, their eyes flicking toward doors as if expecting someone powerful to appear at any moment. Ethan, of course, seemed oblivious. He strutted through the cafeteria in a Captain America hoodie, shouting into his AirPods about bounce house logistics as if the party were the only thing that mattered. He was either dangerously blind or too arrogant to care. That afternoon, he swaggered into the compliance suite and leaned against my desk with a grin that made my stomach turn. "Hey there, Wonder Woman," he said, balancing a cupcake on a flimsy paper plate. "Nervous about the email apocalypse? Do not sweat it. These board guys, they just want a fall guy. It will blow over. And it will not be me." He took a bite of frosting and smirked like the matter was settled. I stared at him without blinking and said, "I would like to take the afternoon off. I need to gather some notes." He waved his hand, crumbs scattering. "Totally. Treat yourself. Just do not ghost me before Saturday. Lily will cry." I picked up my bag, walked out, and did not answer. But I did not go home. Instead, I slipped into a storage cage on the second floor, a forgotten corner filled with broken printers and dust-covered chairs. I propped the door with an old paper shredder, plugged in my laptop, and shut off the Wi-Fi. Then I pulled out my encrypted drive, opened my growing archive, and began to build. Paul had lit the signal, but I knew one email would not be enough. If the chairman was really on his way, they would need evidence that could not be denied, spun, or buried under cupcakes. I worked until the janitorial crew turned off the lights, and still I kept going, each keystroke pulling me closer to a truth Ethan could never rewrite. I sat hunched over that dusty desk in the storage cage with nothing but a flickering bulb above me and the hum of vending machines echoing down the hallway. Hours slipped by as my fingers clawed across the keyboard, pulling together every file, every approval, every deviation that Ethan and Brandon had touched. This was no longer just a folder of curiosities. It was a dossier, a weapon shaped out of timestamps and signatures, built to withstand every excuse and spin their side might attempt. I named it plainly, MedCore Q4 Audit Trail. It was the truth, locked in numbers. The deeper I dug, the uglier it became. Procurement logs showed duplicate vendor entries rubber stamped without review. Certifications were marked as valid months before vendors had even submitted them. Some files carried digital signatures that did not match our internal records, proof of tampering hidden in metadata most executives would never think to check. One Slack thread showed Brandon approving a vendor because he liked their innovative branding, ignoring the fact that their sterile room papers were 6 months overdue. Another screen capture carried Ethan's own words, typed in neon arrogance. "Nobody reads these reports. Just fudge them. LOL." I stared at that line until my jaw hurt from clenching. It was the smoking gun, and it was mine to preserve. By 3 a.m, my spreadsheet had grown into a living map of negligence. 11 tabs, 76 documents, 47 internal references. Every irregularity was linked to a policy clause, every date cross-referenced against archived systems, every note written with the precision of someone who knew regulators would one day pore over each line. I was exhausted, my back screaming, but the work felt cleaner than sleep. This was not revenge born of rage. It was justice born of order. Ethan could throw cupcakes and slogans into the air, but my receipts would land like iron. At dawn, I pushed my chair back and flexed my stiff hands. The screen glowed with rows of color-coded entries, an unbroken chain of facts. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Proof does not need applause. It does not need confetti or costume parties. Proof only needs to exist, and once it does, it has a gravity that cannot be denied. I labeled the USB drive in black marker, Q4 timeline complete. Then, with a flicker of irony I could not resist, I slid a sticker across its surface that read, "Happy birthday, though, Lily." I left the cage as the first employees began trickling in, clutching coffee cups and avoiding each other's eyes. The building smelled faintly of buttercream frosting, remnants of the endless cupcake carts. My steps felt heavier, but not from dread, from certainty. Ethan thought he was the culture, thought he was immune. But culture does not erase compliance, and arrogance does not outlive evidence. I tucked the USB into my bag and whispered to myself as the elevator doors closed. When the storm hits, they will not be able to look away. By the time Friday arrived, the office looked less like a company and more like a stage set for a carnival. Streamers in Marvel colors dangled across the atrium, and employees shuffled past balloons with grim faces hidden under half-hearted smiles. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, chest puffed in a Captain America t-shirt, shouting about bounce houses and synergy as though the company's very survival depended on a child's birthday party. But my phone buzzed with a single message from a number I recognized only because I had once seen it on an emergency escalation form. It read, "Chairman on site. 10 minutes. I slipped away from the chaos, climbed the stairs, and walked toward the boardroom with the USB in my hand. The glass doors loomed tall and silent, guarded by two unfamiliar men in dark suits. They did not stop me. They simply opened the door as though they had been expecting me. Inside, the air was colder, the lights softer, and the chatter absent. This was not a party. This was judgment. I placed the USB on the polished oak table, slid it forward, and spoke only one sentence. "Everything you need begins on page 1. My voice was steady. My hands did not shake. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, and now it was here. The chairman, Howard Gray, a man known for speaking less than anyone else in the room, nodded once and opened the first file. His eyes scanned the approval log dated weeks before a vendor had even submitted their paperwork. Another board member leaned forward, brow furrowing as they reached the second entry. An altered timestamp scrubbed and reinserted with metadata that screamed tampering. By the third, Brandon's unauthorized signature glowing in a space it did not belong. The silence fractured. "What am I looking at?" one of them muttered, voice sharp. I did not answer. I did not need to. The document spoke louder than I ever could. A cough rattled in the corner, then a whisper. If the FDA saw this, we would be finished. Another voice cut in, clipped and angry. They will see it. We will be reporting this ourselves. My heart thudded at the weight of those words. Self-reporting meant MedCorp was bracing for impact, choosing to bleed now rather than be gutted later. The chairman kept turning pages, jaw tight, eyes unflinching. He reached the Slack screenshot where Ethan had typed, "Let's just fudge the numbers." Nobody reads these things. His jaw flexed like stone grinding against stone. I sat back slightly, hands folded in my lap, letting the silence do the work. There was no need for me to explain, no need to add my voice. This was not a performance. It was a reckoning. For weeks, Ethan had filled the air with slogans, frosting, and noise. But here in this room, the noise had died. Only truth remained. The weight shifted off my shoulders and onto theirs, and I watched the realization spread across their faces. It was no longer my burden. It was theirs to carry now, and it was crushing them in real time. When the chairman finally looked up at me, his gaze was heavy but clear. He did not smile, he did not thank me, but he gave the smallest of nods. That was enough. I had done my part. Outside the boardroom, faint music from the atrium leaked through the walls, the sound of children's laughter colliding with the gravity of collapse. Ethan still believed he was in control, but his time was already over. The decision had been made. The only thing left was to deliver the verdict. The atrium looked like a carnival held hostage by corporate branding. Balloons in red and gold sagged against the ceiling, and a rented smoke machine hissed faintly beside the cake table. Ethan stood on a makeshift stage, shield in one hand and microphone in the other, beaming at employees dressed in cheap capes and paper masks. "This is culture," he shouted, slapping the foam shield against his palm. "This is family." The crowd gave a scattered clap, the kind that dies almost as soon as it starts. He did not notice. He was too busy preaching synergy through frosting. Then the double doors opened. Chairman Howard Gray entered without announcement, his tailored suit cutting through the chaos like a blade. Two legal aides trailed behind him, their faces set in stone. Conversations faltered. The music lowered on instinct, as though even the DJ sensed the weight that had just entered the room. Children in costumes froze mid-bounce. Every head turned. For the first time since he arrived at MedCorp, Ethan lost his rhythm. His grin faltered as he squinted into the lights, spotting the chairman. "Oh, hey," he stammered nervously. "Did not know you were coming. Grab a cupcake. We've got gluten-free." Howard's voice cut across the atrium like a gavel. Calm. Cold. Final. "You are relieved of duty. Effective immediately. Legal will escort you out." The silence that followed was total, broken only by the soft hiss of the smoke machine. Ethan laughed weakly, raising his shield like a prop. "Come on, this is dramatic, right? Let's just breathe. Cap would not give up this easy." Security stepped forward, firm hands settling at his elbows. The grin collapsed from his face, replaced by panic. "Wait, hold on. We are family," he pleaded, voice cracking. But the chairman did not flinch. "You are done." And just like that, Ethan Price, the man who had mocked compliance and stolen our bonuses, was walked past the very employees he had tried to dazzle with slogans and frosting. Nobody clapped. Nobody jeered. They just watched in cold silence as his shield dragged against the floor. I stood near the stairwell, half in shadow, watching it unfold. The chairman paused only once, just long enough to turn his eyes toward me. A small nod, almost imperceptible, but heavy with meaning. No words, just acknowledgement. That was enough. By dusk, Ethan was gone. The balloons sagged into rubber carcasses across the floor. The cake melted, untouched. An email from legal confirmed what the nod had already told me. I was being appointed Director of Compliance, effective immediately. There was no ceremony, no applause. Just a new nameplate, a reactivated budget, and the quiet weight of authority restored. That evening, I sat in my office as the sun dipped behind the parking lot, the glow of my monitor casting light across the stack of evidence I had archived in triplicate. My phone buzzed with a single message. "Welcome to your new role." I powered down my laptop, slid the USB-labeled Q4 timeline into the locked drawer of my desk, and exhaled slowly. No costumes, no cupcakes, no confetti. Just the sound of quiet victory and the knowledge that truth had prevailed. Revenge had never been my goal, but justice. Steady, patient, undeniable, was mine to keep. Here is what this taught me. Culture without accountability is decoration. Numbers do not forgive lies. And quiet integrity beats loud theater every time. So keep your records. Protect your team. Ask the hard questions. And when the line is crossed, choose the truth and stand in it. Now tell me, where is your line? Have you faced a bonus reimagine moment? What would you have done differently? Add your lesson in the comments so another person can find their voice. Share this if it helped you breathe a little easier. And if stories of justice and resilience speak to you, follow Revenge Vault, because the next time someone tries to buy loyalty with frosting and speeches, you will remember this. You will remember that proof is power, and power reclaimed quietly is still power.